Unit 5, Revolutions from 1750 to 1900. Unit 5, Subunit 1, The Enlightenment. As empires expanded, interactions and intellectuals in the 17th and 18th centuries, such as Descartes, began to emphasize reason over tradition and individualism over community values. This was called the Enlightenment. The movement of ideals such as individualism, freedom, and self-determination challenged monarchs and church leaders that wanted and propelled the seeds of revolution in the United States, France, and the entire world. During the Renaissance of the scientific revolution, it was usually seen as very optimistic. Many writers believed that the natural laws would result in progress and not diminish the existence of God. While traditional religion did not disappear, it became less persuasive. New ideas emerged about how to improve society. Schools of thought such as liberalism and socialism was giving rise to a period called the Age of Isms. Socialism and liberalism were the currents of conservatism, particularly against the European ruling class. This clash of ideas from old political structures versus new ideas led to revolutions, which often had two aims. The first aim was independence from imperial powers and constitutional representation within the empire. Nationalism led to the breakup of empires and the emergence of new governments, which often followed. Nationalism was a feeling of intense loyalty to others who share one language and culture. In Europe, there were a lot of multi-ethnic empires, which had the threat of destroying it because they wanted an independent nation. In the 17th century, empiricism was the belief that knowledge comes from sensed experiences which you observe through your experience, including experiments. Francis Bacon emphasized this with not relying on reasons and rather principles. His conclusions often came from observations of natural data. Hobbes and Locke, within the same century, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke viewed political life as a social contract in which humans gave up some rights to a strong government in return for law and order. Locke, on the other hand, agreed that the social contract implied the right and even the responsibility of citizens to vote against an unjust government. Locke believed that people had natural rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Philosophers in the 18th century explored social, political, and economic theories in new ways. They felt and followed rationally upon scientific thinkers in the 17th century. And the writers of the new Constitution in France and America came from the ideas of Baron Montesquieu, who, in his famous work, The Spirit of Laws, praised the British government on the use of checks on power because it had a parliament. Montesquieu thus influenced the American system, which adopted the ideas by separating the government into three branches: the executive, legislative, and the judiciary branch. Voltaire, another writer, is known for his social satire Candide in 762, in which he advocated for the civil liberties. and campaigned for religious liberty and judicial reform. Another contemporary of Voltaire was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who expanded the idea of social contract from Hobbes and Locke and presented the concept of general will of population, in which the obligation of a sovereign to carry out their general will. Adam Smith, another influential thinker, in his book Wealth of Nations, responded to mercantilism by calling for freer trade. He generally advocated for laissez-faire, which was a French phrase for leave alone. This meant that the government would reduce their intervention in economic decisions, and that businesses and customers were allowed to make their own choices, and that the invisible hand of the market would guide them to make the choices for a better society. Adam Smith's ideas for laissez-faire resulted in capitalism, which is an economic system in which the means for production, such as factories, natural resources, and privately owned, are operated for profit. Deism was the emphasis on reason led by thinkers to re-examine the relationship of humans to God. Some adopted deism, and that the belief that a divinity simply set the natural laws in motion, and to follow scientific inquiry rather than the study of the Bible. Despite this unorthodox idea, many deists viewed regular church attendance as it was an important social and moral obligation. The economic and political theory of socialism referred to the system of public or direct worker ownership of means of production such as mills to make cloth or machinery, and land needed to mine coal. Utopian socialism was set up by utopian socialists who felt that society could be channeled into positive directions by setting up ideal communities that were called utopian socialists. And the belief in traditional institutions favoring reliance on practical experience over ideological theories such as human perfectibility is called conservatism. The Fabian Society was a group made by socialist groups in the late 19th century in England. They favored reforming society by parliamentary means. Classical liberalism advocated a belief in natural rights, constitutionalism, government, laissez-faire economics, and reduced spending on armies and established churches. Most liberals were professional writers or academics. They pursued changes in parliament to reflect changing population patterns so that new industrial cities would have equal representation. This period in the 18th century saw feminism, which was the emergence of the rights and inequality based on Enlightenment ideas. Olympe de Gouges fought for these rights in the French Revolution. Oui. In 1792, pioneering writer Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she argued that females should receive the same education as males, and that women should be prepared to participate in political and professional society, which would enable them to support themselves rather than relying on men. Wollstone's ultimate goal was for women to gain rights and the same abilities of men through the application of reason, which was brought about through the Enlightenment.
I love women's rights.
We love women's rights.
Yeah.
Another reform movement that provided rights and equality to enslaved people and to the end of serfdom was called abolitionism. And that's the correct way to pronounce it. And that was a movement used to end the Atlantic slave trade and free all enslaved people. Slave trading was banned earlier than slavery itself. The first states to ban slave trades were with Denmark in 1803 and Great Britain in 1807, and the United States actually in 1808. In most countries, slave system was dependent on a steady supply of newly enslaved people. However, the United States was a rare country in which the numbers increased after the importation of enslaved people ended. The last country to end slavery in the Americas was Brazil in 1888. Serfdom in Europe was also steadily declining as the economy changed from agrarian to industrial. Peasant revolts pushed leaders towards reform. Queen Elizabeth I abolished serfdom in 1574, and nobility in 1789 in France. Zionism was the emergence of the desire of Jews to establish an independent homeland where their ancestors lived in the Middle East. After battling anti-Semitism, many Jews fled to Palestine and concluded that living in peace and security was not a realistic hope. Zionism increased after a scandal in France known as Dreyfus Affair in 1984, in which Dreyfus, who was a military officer and Jew, was convicted of treason against the French government. It was only based on forged documents in which the people were promoting anti-Semitism. He was later pardoned for his time in prison. Zionists faced many obstacles and wanted land that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire and Arabs that were already living in the regions. Both Ottomans and Palestinians were Muslim, which added a religious aspect to the conflict.
Subunit 2 of Unit 5, Nationalism and Revolutions. The Age of New Ideas led to political and philosophical conflicts. Like the English statesman Edmund Burke, the French thinker Joseph de Maistre was a conservative who went against the tide of Enlightenment thinking. In the view of conservative thinkers such as Burke and Maistre, revolutions were bloody, disruptive, and unlikely to yield positive results. However, try as conservatives might to quell the revolutionary change, the desire of common people to constitutional government and democratic practices erupted in revolutions throughout the 19th century, and many nations did indeed get new form of government that responded to the new wave of thinking with its key ideas: progress, reason, and natural law. First, let's start with the American Revolution, the most important. The Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, expressed the philosophy behind the colonists' fight against the British rule. In the document, Thomas Jefferson picked up the phrase unalienable rights from John Locke. For Jefferson, these rights were to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the war that followed, the colonists triumphed in 1783 with crucial help from Britain's longtime enemy, France. Speaking of the France, I'm going to talk about the French Revolution next. They had extreme economic woes, and this caused a great distraught in the French people. So, the revolution begins. Gulp. In the early days of the French Revolution, moderates such as Marquis de Lafayette seemed to be on the point of establishing a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly began meeting in Paris, but then the king threatened to arrest the leaders. Angry crowds rioted in Paris, and a former prison that symbolized the abuses of the monarchy and the corrupt aristocracy in the French countryside. Peasants rose up against nobles, even burning some manor houses. Some royals officials fled to France. The king was forced to accept a new government with a national assembly in charge. On July 14th, 1789, it became the French Independence Day. The most permanent changes were enacted early in the Revolution: the abolition of feudalism and adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a statement declaring basic human rights. The Reign of Terror, a period during which the government executed thousands of opponents of revolution, including the king and queen, sprang from the Jacobins. After a period of turmoil and war, the brilliant General Napoleon Bonaparte became Emperor of France in 1804. Now, let's discuss the Creole revolutions in Latin America. On the Latin American mainland, revolutionary ideals were taken up by Creoles. Born of the European ancestry in the Americas, the Creoles were well educated and aware of the ideas behind the revolutions in North America and France. They considered themselves superior to the Mestizos, who were born of European and Indian parents, or Native American parents. Colonists who were born in Spain or Portugal, known as peninsulares, felt superior to everyone. At the bottom of the social ladder, there was enslaved Africans and indigenous population, the mulattoes. Those of African and either European or indigenous ancestry. There were many reasons for discontent in the colonies, each of which encouraged some of the people to desire independence. Creoles wanted more political power. They resented that Spain tended to give important government jobs in the colonies to peninsulares. Mestizos wanted political power and a share of the wealth in the colonies. Many had jobs in the towns or worked in the mines on the estates of the peninsulares and Creoles. The results of the Creole revolutions, it legally ended slavery and some social distinctions. Governments were often conservative, though. The first constitution of Peru, for example, forbade voting by those who could not read or write in Spanish, which effectively denied most indigenous people and the vote until the constitution changed in 1860. The Creoles formed a powerful and conservative upper class, as they had before the wars of colonial independence. Now let's discuss the nationalism and unification in Europe. The first place I will talk about is Italy. At the time, the region was divided among a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states, and most people spoke regional languages rather than Italian. Cavour himself spoke France better than he spoke Italian. Shut up. Like other classical liberals, he believed in natural rights, progress, and constitutional monarchy, but he also believed in practical politics of reality, which became called realpolitik. Thus, he did not hesitate to advance the cause of Italian unity through manipulation. For real. In 1858, he maneuvered Napoleon III of France into a war with Austria, hoping to weaken the Austrian influence on the Italian peninsula. This shows he was a master manipulator.
You skipped nationalism.
Ottoman nationalism. The 1870s and 1880s saw the development in the Ottoman state of Ottomanism. This was a movement aimed to create a more modern, unified state. Officials sought to do this by minimizing the ethnic, linguistic, and religious differences across the empire. Taking control of local schools and mandating a standard curriculum was a major part of this drive. But the effects of nationalism were not limited to the Balkan territories and Ottoman officials. Ethnic and religious groups within the Ottoman Empire had nationalist urges of their own, and they viewed Ottomanism with suspicion. Ironically, this attempt to create a more unified state actually served to highlight and intensify subjects' people's feelings of difference and promote their desire for independence. Now, finally, the future of nationalism. While nationalism continues to shape how people view themselves and their political allegiances, some signs suggest that nationalism might be starting to decline. In Europe, many countries have agreed to use the same currency, to allow people to travel freely across borders and to coordinate public policies. These changes might reflect a shift away from nationalism and towards a larger political grouping. Like city-states and empires, nations might someday give way to other forms of political organization.
Unit 5, Subunit 3, Industrial Revolution begins. The increased mechanization of production and social changes that accompanied this shift of nationalism, which was the technologies which reshaped societies and led to a dramatic change in societies and economies. This mechanization shifted several influences. Among these were the Columbian Exchange, rise of maritime trading empires, increased agriculture productivity, and greater individual accumulation of capital. The world population increased. People went from farm to city, and production and consumption of goods expanded. In the early 1700s, the agricultural revolution increased productivity. The crop rotation and seed drill were different ways that the agricultural revolution was brought about. Medical care was improved, infant mortality rates declined, people lived generally longer. This also led to demographics of people being able to work in factories and providing a market for manufactured goods. In the early 18th century, most British families lived in a rural area where they made their own food and their own clothes. However, since the commercial revolution and maritime empires, Indian cotton became available in Britain, and before long, it became in high demand. The raw cotton, which was produced by slave labor in Americas, developed the cotton industry system, also known as the putting out system, which where merchants provided raw cotton to women who spun it, then finished cloth in their own homes. The pay was low and the work was hard, but the cotton industry gave women weavers some form of independence. Although investors demanded faster production and the development of technologies which made cloth in more efficient ways. This resulted in the spinning jenny and water frame, which reduced the time to spin yarn and weave cloth. Inventor Eli Whitney created an interchangeable parts for manufacturing firearms in the U.S. military. This meant that if a part of a machine were to break, it could easily be replaced with a new identical part. This reduced the cost of replacements and was a pivotal contribution to the industrial technology. This also resulted in the division of labor, which meant that factory owners did not have to heavily rely on skilled laborers to craft every single component. Instead, each worker could focus on one component of the task and then put this into an assembly line, such as when Ford manufactured Model T automobiles. Britain became the leader in industrialization from their environmental and geographical advantages. They had seaways and raw materials imported and exported for finished goods. Britain had mineral resources such as coal, which was located on immense coal deposits. This fossil fuel was the energy for large factories and was made bridges, buildings, and ships. Britain also received resources from the many colonies, which they also accumulated during the transatlantic slave trade. They also had abundant capital in which they had much money to spend in businesses and invest in different things. The combination of abundant rivers, strong fleets, protection of private property, and growing urbanization all resulted in Britain becoming the main leader in industrialization. The enclosure movement was the movement in which the government fenced off the commons to give exclusive use of it to the people who paid for the privilege of the purchased land. This brought many landless and destitute farmers who were forced to move from rural areas to urban areas such as Manchester and Liverpool.
Subunit 4. Industrialization spreads. Although the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, it soon spread elsewhere. The British cottage industry system for the production of cotton, in which merchants provided raw cotton to be spun into cloth in workers' homes, was supplanted by the industrialization of cotton manufacture in factories. Cotton became an increasingly valuable commodity in the world economy as industrialized Britain, with higher productivity, was able to replace Indian and Middle Eastern goods. After Britain industrialized, Belgium and then France and Germany followed, and eventually Russia and Japan became industrialized. These countries possessed many characteristics that allowed Britain to industrialize, including capital, natural resources, and water transportation. Some of the products that were produced were wheat, rubber, sugar, and cotton. The wheat was mainly from Russia and Britain. The rubber was mainly from Brazilian Amazon. The sugar was from the Caribbean islands and Brazil, and the cotton was from the United States. Russia also began to industrialize, focusing particularly on railroads and exports. By 1900, Russia had more than 36,000 miles of railroad connecting its commercial and industrial areas. The Trans-Siberian Railroad stretched from Moscow to the Pacific Ocean, allowing Russia to trade easily with countries in East Asia such as China and Japan. Egypt and India were both among the first to engage in the production of trade of textiles. Just as it stifled the production of ships and iron, British colonization also affected textile production in India. As the textile industry flourished in India, it undermined the British textile mills in Britain. Specifically in Lancaster, the owners of the Lancaster textile mills pressured the British government in India to impose an equalizing 5% tax on all textiles produced at the more than 80 mills operating in Bombay, thus undermining their profitability.
Unit 5, Subunit 5, Technology in the Industrial Age. The Industrial Revolution was very important economically. It saw innovations and molded nature in the service of humankind. The steam engine and combustion engine powered railroads, ships, factories, increased access to resources, and also increased the distribution of goods for those resources which were produced. The second wave, also known as the Second Industrial Revolution, came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which involved the chemicals, steels, machine precision, and electronics. The coal revolution in the 1700s produced a version of the steam engine made by James Watt, which harnessed coal to create steam. Water transportation was revolutionized by steamships, which were used for sailing. The coal made production mobile and dependable. Instead of being fixed on one place, as a river was, coal power steam engines could be built anywhere and could be used on ships and trains. Unlike the wind, engines could be turned on when needed and turned off when not. This made boats and lakes no longer dependable on winds for power. You could sail much faster upstream, and it could be towed by people and animals along shore. This resulted in coaling stations, which were critical points on trade routes, such as Cape Colony in South Africa and various islands in the Pacific. Iron was also used to power steam engines and made it possible, and coal made it possible to produce iron furnaces. Cast iron was strong but brittle, making it difficult to stretch and shape. However, English Henry Cort in 1794 made it much less strong and more workable. The countries which brought about the Second Industrial Revolution were the US, Great Britain, and Germany. Steel production, chemicals, precision machinery, and electronics were the developments in the Second Revolution. So, steel production resulted in steel, which was an alloy of iron and carbon, and made it possible to molt and refine the metal, which allowed steel to become the actual versatile backbone of the industrial society. Oil in the mid-1800s was drilled, tapped into, and became a new source of energy. Petroleum, like coal, is a fossil fuel derived from plant and animal remains. An important product from petroleum was kerosene, which was used for lighting heaters. And in 1847, techniques were used to extract kerosene from petroleum. Another power was electricity, which became an electrical generator. The first public power station was in London in 1882. The development of electricity and electronics helped lead to developments such as communication. The patent for a telephone was issued to Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, and early phone systems were used in low quality. However, Thomas Edison in 1886 designed a refined voice transmitting device made for telephone, which made use more practical. The telegraph allowed immediate communication, and the construction of railroads made the Transcontinental Railroad, which connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and was completed in 1869, which was facilitated by the U.S. industrial growth and subsidized by public funds. The desire for capital made money available to invest in business and was actually a driving force domestically and abroad. Trade and migration often centered on coastal cities. Railroads, steamships, and telegraph opened up exploration to the interior regions around the globe and increased trade and migration.
Subunit 6, Industrialization, Government's Role. As Western domination and technology spread, they met with varying degrees of acceptance in different nations. Each country experienced competing pressures between preservation of traditional values and modernization. Egypt early adopted policies that encouraged the use of industrialized innovations such as steam engine to boost textile productivity to compete with modernized countries and maintain its independence. Japan changed several of its institutions to reflect more Western practices. Others, such as China, were less willing to accept European influences and products and suffered because of economic and political expansion by Western nations. China's weakened government and population was unable to promote industrialization effectively. Now, let's talk about Japan.
Let's talk about Japan.
Yes, very arigato. Japan sought to maintain its cultural and territorial integrity in the face of Western challenges. Emperor Meiji resisted pressure from the West by using its innovations to strengthen Japan. Japan's transition to a modern industrialized country took less than half a century to accomplish. No other country made such a rapid change. Between 1600 and 1854, Japan had very little contact with the rest of the world. This was isolation. However, the rising imperial powers in the world were not content to let Japan keep to itself. The great powers of Europe, such as Great Britain and Netherlands and Russia, all wanted to sell goods to Japan. Further, in the age of coal-powered ships, trading states wanted to be able to refuel in Japan as they sailed to China and other parts of the East Asia. In 1853, a naval squad led by Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853 basically changed how Japan interacted with the world forever. Moving on, the role of private investments was very important. While the relationship between industry and centralized government was key to modernization in Japan, private investment from overseas also became important. Once new industries were flourishing, they were sometimes sold to zaibatsu, powerful Japanese family business organizations like the conglomerates in the United States. The prospect of attracting investors encouraged innovation in technology. For example, a carpenter founded a company in 1906 called Toyota Loom Works that made an automatic loom. The company prospered, modified its name, and grew into today's Toyota Motor Company. Ooh la la.
Unit 5, Subunit 7, Economic Developments and Innovations. The industrial and modernization led to philosophies and business structures. Adam Smith argued that humans are naturally transactional and provided a foundational text to support capitalism and the establishment of private entrepreneurship and shaped the economies of political structures of the age and centuries which followed. Mercantilism was a system of economic protection which was replaced by a laissez-faire policy that promoted minimal government involvement and commerce, which encouraged countries to reduce tariffs on trade. Businesses during the Industrial Revolution formed giant corporations in order to minimize risk, and that Those corporations were chartered by government as a legal entity which was owned by stockholders, which were individuals who bought partial ownership directly in the company when it was formed later through a stock market. Those stockholders would receive dividends. A monopoly was formed when corporations became so powerful they had control of the entire specific business and eliminated all competition. For example, Alfred Krupp from Germany used the Bessemer process, which was an efficient way to produce steel, and gained a monopoly in the German steel industry. John D. Rockefeller himself created a monopoly in the oil industry. Cecil Rhodes was an enthusiastic investor for a railroad project that stretched from Cape Town to South Africa, Cairo, Cairo, Egypt, and connected all British-held colonies with a transportation network which would make governance easier and aid in conducting a war, if necessary. The project was not completed, though, and Britain never gained control over all the land in which the railroad was to be built. A business owned by a single person is called a sole proprietorship, and a partnership is a small group of people who make all business decisions. Corporations are different from these two forms of business because a corporation is more flexible in structure for a large-scale economic activity. It replaced the traditional system of an entrepreneur engaging in high-risk business decisions. Instead, larger companies collectively engage in low-risk efforts. This makes it much more safer and more attractive. Gee whiz. Banking and finance. Another way to look at these reduced risk was through insurance. The number of banks rose as merchants and entrepreneurship looked for reliable places to deposit money and to borrow it when needed to build a factory or hire workers for a new enterprise. A culture of consumerism as well as leisure developed among the working and middle class of society in Britain, and the living standards rose for some people.
Subunit 8. Reactions to the industrial economy. The harsh conditions of industrial life provoked resistance and calls for reform. Mother Jones, a labor organizer, described the severe deprivations of the coal miners working underground all day, and other activists told of the horrors of factory work. Philosophers such as John Stuart Mill sought to address this growing inhumanity and the industrial era through social reforms. Others, such as the utopian socialists, argued for completely changing a system they considered to be basically flawed. Workers reformed trade unions to advocate for higher pay and safer working conditions. Various ideologies and the political movements emerged, some promoting alternative visions of society. The Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean basin, China and Japan also instituted reforms to promote industrialization. In response, in each faced reactions against the results of economic change. The labor unions created voting rights, and child labor laws. They wanted to improve living conditions of the workers, and the law for child labor in 1843 declared that children under the age of 10 were banned from working in the coal mines. In 1881, education became mandatory for British children between the ages of 5 and 10. This focus on education as opposed to work for monetary gain permanently refined the role of children in urban society. Karl Marx was also a very important feller. 1818 to 1883, he was a German scholar and writer who argued for socialism. In 1848, Karl Marx and his wealthy supporter Friedrich Engels published a pamphlet now called the Communist Manifesto that summarized their critique of capitalism. According to Marx, capitalism was an advance on feudalism because it produced tremendous wealth, but that also produced feudalism because it produced tremendous. This contradiction between wealth and poverty occurred because capitalism divided society into two basic classes. The proletariat was essentially the working class, working in factories and mines, often for little compensation, and the bourgeoisie, including the middle class and investors who owned machinery and factories where workers produced goods. I don't agree with communism. It's bad. Let's move on to reforms in China. Like other powers, China, under the Qing dynasty, felt pressure to modernize. Its major reform effort in the late 19th century was known as the self-strengthening movement. It developed as a way for the government to face the internal and external problems confronting China. Government officials hoped to strengthen China in its competition with foreign powers by advancing its military technology and readiness by training Chinese artisans in the manufacture of items for shipyards and arsenals. There was a reform in the Chinese civil service as well. The civil service was designed according to Confucian ideals of respect for rank and hierarchy, as well as values of civic participation and action. By the 19th century, though, the wealthy were using civil servants to get favors. Revenue dropped off for the government as a result of bribes going into pockets of corrupt civil servants. Moreover, non-qualified persons were purchasing civil service posts. China abandoned nearly 2,500 years of tradition, one that had yielded an educated bureaucracy of scholar gentry. In spite of this concession, the empress's overall conservatism caused her to fail to cope with demands of modernity in China. Resistance to reform in Japan. The Bushido was the Japanese code of conduct, and it did not condone the government because it didn't. There was also limits to reforms all over the world. Turkey, China, and Japan each followed its own path in responding to industrialization in the 19th century. Of the three, Turkey began to take changes earliest. However, Sultan Abdul Hamid, though he supported reforms at first, became more conservative during his time as ruler. China began to make changes only later in the century. In contrast to Abdul Hamid, China's Sixi started to be skeptical of reform, but became more liberal during her reign. Japan responded to industrialization with dramatic, rapid changes, beginning with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. However, the speed and depth of its reforms prompted a backlash from the conservative members of society.
Unit 5, Subunit 9, Society and the Industrial Age. With little planning from the government and urban areas growing rapidly in the first half of the 19th century, damaging ecological footprint and inhumane living conditions for cities were created. Working families were pushed to tenement apartment buildings, often owned by factory owners themselves, and they were located in the urban slums, where industrial byproducts such as polluted water, supplies, and open sewers were common. With these conditions, disease, including the much feared Gloria, spread quickly, so as well as other public health menaces, such as fire, crime, and violence. Municipalities created police and fire departments, and many health acts were passed to implement sanitation reform by creating better drainage, sewage systems, and supplying clean water. As industrialization spread, classes within society, such as Britain, emerged. At the bottom were the working class, known as who worked in the factories and coal mines. They helped construct goods rapidly and was a key member of the division of labor. While industrialization created low-skilled jobs, it also required people who have education and sophisticated skills, such as the middle class, in which there were white-collar workers who were in the office and the most literate and considered middle class. Now, at the top of the new class of the hierarchy were the industrialists and owners of those large corporations, captains of industry, which overshadowed the landed aristocracy and power brokers, who were the leaders of modern society. Before industrialization, families worked in close proximity, regardless of occupation. But in factory, work schedules were nothing like on the farm and cotton industry. And it was a real culture shock to former farmers who previously completed tasks according to their own needs and schedules. Workers commonly spent 14 hours a day, 6 days a week in the factory. Exhaustion was common. Some of these exhausted workers operated dangerous and heavy machineries. Injuries and death were common. Low wages of factory workers made children and forced them into work. In the early decades of industrialization, children as young as 5 years old worked in textiles mills, Because of their small size and nimble fingers, children could climb into equipment to make repairs or tight spots in mines. However, this damaged their lungs as much as it did adults' lungs. The effect of women on the Industrial Revolution depended on their class position. Working class women worked in coal mines, and factory owners preferred to hire women because they could pay them half of what men paid. Middle class women were spared factory work, yet had a more limited life than working class women, which made them leave the house and work in an office if a wife stayed at home. Industrialization spurred feminism. When men left a community to take a job, this absence made opportunities for women. Now, moving on to the effects of the environment. Revolution was powered by fossil fuels, such as we talked about, like coal, petroleum, kerosene from the petroleum, natural gases, iron, steel. And the burning of coal produced energy, but also was extremely harmful to the air and resulted in toxic air pollution from these factories. Water became polluted when industry dumped their waste to rivers, streams, and lakes. Diseases from this water ravaged neighborhoods. Now, overall, from the Industrial Revolution's legacy, mass production made goods cheaper, more abundant, and more accessible than ever before. The factories attracted people to move from rural areas to cities. Agrarian countries went to industrial. Low-skilled workers and high-skilled professionals moved to take advantage of this opportunity. Air and water was polluted. Working populations became concentrated in working areas, so urban areas. An unequal relationship was between worker and owners was created. Global inequalities increased, and more raw materials were desired.
Subunit 10, Continuity and Change in the Industrial Age. The Industrial Revolution, an era that began in the late 18th century, produced economic, social, cultural, political, and environmental changes not seen since the first agricultural revolution. More than 10,000 years before, the Industrial Revolution changed how goods were produced, how people earned their living, and how businesses were structured. The Industrial Revolution also caused sweeping social changes. An expansion of the middle class in industrialized economies occurred. A working class dependent on factory jobs emerged. The role of women was transformed as they made up a significant portion of factory workforce. Politically, the Enlightenment period proved to be a long-lasting and influential intellectual movement that influenced events during the Industrial Revolution. The effects of the Industrial Revolution inspired the works of economic and political philosophers like Adam Smith and Karl Marx. The Industrial Revolution altered life logically as well as globally. Rivalries among nations which had existed previously continued into and throughout this era, leading to political and economic conflict. Additionally, rigid social orders based on economic or ethnic status continued within industrial economies. Industrialization around the world. New methods of industrial production associated with the Industrial Revolution spread and changed the economies of other areas of the world outside of Western Europe. As a result, the United States, Russia, and Japan experienced increased industrial production and built more railroads. In the cases of Japan and Egypt, industrialization was encouraged through state sponsored efforts to modernize their economies with varying degrees of success. However, the industrial economies of Western Europe and United States continued to dominate the global economy, while the manufacturing output of Middle Eastern and Asian economies declined. They had to find some way to get the new sources of raw materials, so they would go to other countries they viewed as inferior and they took their raw materials. Then they would also force the people of that area to work for them for free. Um, Reforms that began in the country for protecting workers often spread. For example, Otto von Bismarck's social reforms spread throughout Europe and eventually the world. All industrializing nations grappled with new challenges that factory life introduced. Among these nations, Germany implemented the most comprehensive set of social reforms to protect industrial workers. Under the leadership of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Germany started workers' accident compensation insurance, unemployed insurance, and old age pensions for employees. Bismarck was concerned that if his government did not address these problems, socialists and more radical citizens would demand stronger government action. Another effect of expansion of voting rights and the emergence of political parties that represented the working class. These labor parties advocated for minimum wages, shorter workdays, paid sick and holiday leave, better working conditions, and health and unemployment insurance.
Thank you for watching.